Welcome to the first broadcast of 2022 for our World Language webinar series. Today we're going to be focused on the Teacher Effectiveness for Language Learning, or TEL, Learning Experience Domain, LE4. This is part one of this particular focus, and part two will be in February. Today is Wednesday, January 5th, and again, welcome to the new year. I hope you've gotten a good start to 2022 with your students and your work. Today's agenda is coming up on screen. We're going to start with some welcome and introductions today, and then an overview of the TAO criteria and its sub-criteria that we're focusing on. As I said, that's LE4, or the teacher provides opportunities for students to produce language in the interpersonal and presentational modes. After that, we'll have some reflections on implementing LE4 with our proficiency-based North Carolina World Language Essential Standards, specifically with a couple of guest speakers who will be joining us today. Then we'll talk about evidence of LE4 characteristics and behaviors in K-12 World Language classrooms. Finally, we'll do a brief wrap-up and share some reminders for the day. Let's begin with our welcome and introductions. I think most of you know me, but my name is Anne-Marie Gunter. I'm the World Languages Consultant at the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. Today we're using our Webex Space. I know some of you are very familiar with that, with our broadcast this year, but others may be new to it. Here's a slide that shows what the visual display looks like for your control panel. Your particular display may look a little different depending on what type of device you joined us with today or what browser you chose. But in general, you'll see that starting in the upper right corner, there's a place where you can change your video layout. You should just be seeing our slides as we go through this today. And then you can choose a floating panel view and change things around. There in the middle of the screen are the meeting controls. Those are hidden when you're not using them and then reappear when you move your cursor over the screen. The most important ones on those are the one in the middle that looks like a little bubble. That's where you can access our chat box, and you're welcome to put any questions or comments you would like in the chat box. Sometimes we even use the chat box for activities. Please know that in the chat box, you can send a message to me as your host or to our panelists. You can also send it to all attendees. Let's practice that for a moment. Please find your chat box, clicking on that control button, and type a message in so that we can see who's with us today, and maybe just indicate what language you teach in the chat box. Send that message to everyone or to all attendees so that we know who we have in the room linguistically speaking. All right, I'm seeing some variety here, some Spanish teachers greeting us in different ways. Thank you so much. All right, great. Another important button on our control panel is the one on the far right. That's the red button with the X in it. That's what you'll click on to exit the webinar once we're done today. If you have to leave or if you click on it accidentally, don't worry. You can join us again by using the same link you got in with today. Your link always works for this broadcast. Also, you may notice on the far left-hand side, there's a red button with a little microphone with a slash through it. That's because everyone's on mute. We are recording this broadcast today, and we're going to post it as part of the archives. So making sure everyone's on mute, unless they're presenting, is a good way to cut down on background noise. I do want to introduce our guest speakers. One of the features of this year's webinar series is that we're focusing on guest speakers who are model world language teachers. They've distinguished themselves as model teachers by being recognized as Teachers of the Year, either by FLANC, the Foreign Language Association of North Carolina, or from NC Virtual, or they've earned their Global Educator Digital Badge, or GEDB, but they're a world language teacher, so they are sharing their capstone project and things with us through our statewide systems. So those are the world language teachers who are our guest speakers for the series. Specifically today, we're going to have 2 guest speakers. The slide for the first guest speaker is coming up on the screen, as you can see. Give me just a moment, because that guest speaker is, in fact, in the room with us. So I am adding her so she can introduce herself using this slide.
Hello, everyone. I'm Christen Campbell, French teacher at Chapel Hill High School. Thank you all for being here today. I know you're probably exhausted having just finished class if you're like me. I teach levels 1, 2, 3, 4 and AP at Chapel Hill High School, although this year I'm just teaching 3, 4 and AP. And yeah, thank you so much for being here today.
Great, thank you. We're going to get to hear from Christen a little bit later. And we also have Bonnie Wang joining us today. And I'm looking, but it doesn't yet look like she's been able to log on. She also is finishing up class. So she'll join us a bit later, but she was the Teacher of the Year from Flank in 2019. So very recently, just like Christen. She works at the Durham Academy in the upper school and teaches Chinese 1, 2, 3, 4, and AP, as well as advanced topics and Chinese for heritage speakers. You see some of her pictures on the screen with her students. All right, well, now that you know who the presenters are for today, I want to find out who you are. Let's start with some welcoming questions and introductions. The first question is, what motivated you to participate in this webinar today? You can check all that apply. This is a poll question, so this question will actually appear on your control panel so you can respond to it. So was it to access professional development made for world languages, or earn 1 contact hour for license renewal? Maybe you're gathering information to share with colleagues, or learning about implementing our state standards, or just want to find out more about state standards, resources, policies, and so on. I'll go ahead and start our poll question. And you can just click on your control panel which of these responses applies to you for what motivated you to participate in this webinar today. So we have more folks checking in. So when you get in, please go ahead and answer this poll question that's up on the screen and should be in your control panel. We have a few more seconds for you to get your answers in. You can check as many as apply to you. All right, I'm going ahead and sharing the poll results so everyone can see what the responses were. A majority of you have access to professional development of major world languages, and that's exactly why we have this webinar series, so that we can focus on our state standards and world language information that applies to our classrooms. Also, majority of you said you're here to earn 1 contact hour for license renewal. That's always an important thing to do. And your active participation in this broadcast today will earn you a certificate of attendance that will be emailed a week or 2 after the broadcast. There are also people here to learn more about implementing our state standards from other world language teachers. And that's one of the things we're all going to be doing today, helping each other with that, but also listening to our guest speakers share their perspective on this particular call focus we have on interpersonal and presentational communication. We also have some people here gathering information to share with colleagues, maybe from their team or our professional learning community, their department, their school, or their district. We do post the archives, including a recording, the slides, and any activities and links that we use. So you can take that information and repurpose it and recycle it the way you need to locally. We do post the slides in 3 different formats: Google presentation, PowerPoint, and PDF. So that you don't have to recreate slides. You can just download what you need and use them. Finally, we do have almost 20% here who say they want to find out more about state standards, our resources, our policies, and so forth. And we will definitely be talking about some of that. But if you have an individual question, feel free to put it in the chat box, and I will get to it as soon as I can. If you put a question in the chat box anytime throughout the broadcast, we will respond to that question. Or if it's something we're going to be covering, we will wait and respond to it for everyone so that we all benefit from that answer. All right, so now that we know what motivated you to join today, we also want to talk about where are you joining us from today. We live in a virtual world now for sure, but we know that you're probably somewhere in North Carolina or nearby. So where are you joining us from today? Select the region where you're located at this moment. North Carolina is divided into 8 different regions. Those are economic prosperity zones, and there are also regions that we have representation on the State Board of Education from. Some people might also be somewhere else in the U.S. besides North Carolina, or even outside of the state. We occasionally get people who are outside. I'm going to go ahead and open this poll so that you can respond. There you go. Please let us know where you're joining us from today. All right, that's just a quick poll. I'll go ahead and share the poll results with you so that everybody can see. To look across, we have someone, at least 1 or 2 people from almost every region in North Carolina today. So welcome everyone from across the state. We even have 1 or 2 people from outside of North Carolina, but somewhere else in the U.S. So if you're nearby and enjoying good weather like we are in North Carolina, but keep in mind our neighbors to the north who've had some wintry weather, and we're even still recovering from some wintry weather in some places in North Carolina. So I hope everyone is staying safe today and has had a great day with their students and their colleagues. All right, well, now that we know who's here, let's go ahead and get started with an overview of our TAO criteria and sub-criteria. We said, obviously, when we're looking at the learning experience domain, and specifically LE4, the teacher provides opportunities for students to produce language in the interpersonal and presentational modes. For us, you see here how that fits into our World Language Essential Standards. Certainly, our TAO criteria LE4 supports our standards, and specifically, they support our standards with standard number 1, interpersonal communication, and standard number 3, presentational communications. Notice on the right-hand side what we call our weave graphic for our state standards. This shows our 4 essential standards woven into the 3 strands that run throughout all 4 standards. So besides interpersonal and presentational communication, we also have interpretive communication and culture for standards. And then our 3 strands are connections to language and literacy, connections to other disciplines, and communities. Some of you are probably quite familiar with our weave graphic. It comes from our administrator guides for world languages. I'm going to go ahead and put a link to those administrator guides in the chat box so that you can get them if you need to. These are posted as part of our materials for our World Language Essential Standards. They are created for exactly what it says, to help our administrators understand our World Language Essential Standards. The weave graphic itself is on page 1 of all of the administrator guides documents. And if you want to download them individually, because we have 3 different documents, one for classical languages like Latin, one for dual and heritage languages like dual language immersion programs and heritage language, and one for modern languages. And I'll go ahead and put those in there. Those are individual documents, but they all start out with an overview of our standards in the weave graphic. So another thing I have to do is our handout for today, that learning experience document from the TAO project. The TAO learning experience domain criteria were published in 2019, but actually this was a sort of a second edition. The TAO project has been in existence for almost 10 years. And some of you may know already that the first documents from the TAO framework that were published were in 2014. About 5 years later, after taking much feedback, they revised them and they published them in 2019. I'm going to go ahead and put a link in the chat box that has a link that goes to a PDF version of the learning experience document, as well as a link that goes directly to the TAO framework webpage. So you can download the learning experience domain criteria document from either one of those places so that you have a copy of it for our work today. I'm putting that in the chat box right now. All right, so take a moment, download a copy for yourself of the learning experience domain criteria document and skim the 5-lettered sub-criteria for this session's focus, LE4. I'll give you a moment to do that and check some things going on in the chat box. All right. Hope you've had a chance to download that document and look over the 5 sub-criteria for LE4. I am seeing some notes in the chat box about my audio going in and out. I apologize if the broadcast is a little wavery. I've tried to make some adjustments, but I will forewarn you that I'm on a computer that's new to me today. So I'm trying to adjust as we go. Do let me know if my audio becomes problematic or if I lose you by any chance, but we'll always jump back in together. Don't worry. All right, so now you have your TAO learning experience domain criteria document in hand, or on screen maybe would be a better way to say it. So let's go ahead and look at those LE4 criteria and think about them in relation to our North Carolina World Language Essential Standards. Obviously, this particular sub-criteria looks very carefully at standard number 1 and standard number 3. Remember, standard number 1 is interpersonal communication, which is informal, spontaneous communication that you might do with a friend if you were just chatting, or maybe that you were texting with in a written format. And then standard number 3, presentational communication, looks at writing or speaking the language, but in a way that you've rehearsed it or practiced it. So let's consider the TAO criteria with LE4 and its sub-criteria. Sub-criteria A says the teacher facilitates activities that allow students to interact with others and negotiate meaning for a real-world purpose. Obviously, this one's focused on interpersonal communication because your students are interacting together spontaneously and probably somewhat informally. They also have to work together to negotiate meaning, to make sure they understand one another, to ask for clarifications if needed or repetitions, and hopefully for a very real world purpose so that they're using the language in a manner that's very motivating. B for LE4 is the teacher facilitates activities that allow students to share a message with an audience. This one focuses more on presentational communication because they are preparing something in writing or speaking that they're going to share with an audience of some kind, maybe a classmate, maybe online somewhere. They have a blog or something like that, or in other ways. LE4C says the teacher facilitates activities that allow students to produce language within the range of the performance targets. And remember, this is very important for us working with proficiency-based standards. We want our students to be producing language that is helping them build their proficiency towards our proficiency outcomes in the state standards for the particular course that they're in. When they're in class, obviously, there's a difference between performance and proficiency. Performance is what we get them to do as teachers within the classroom, within a structured environment where they get opportunities to practice in different ways. Proficiency, on the other hand, is what they can do once they leave our classrooms on their own without any prompting or particular context of a learning environment. This is where they just use the language that they have learned in ways that benefit them outside of the classroom. Notice that these first three all talk about teachers facilitating activities. So obviously we're going to be focusing on the things we do as teachers to set up learning activities in the classroom that help our students use the language in different ways. LE4D is the teacher provides students with strategies that enable them to stay in the target language. We know that staying in the target language is critically important. The recommendation is 90% or more in the target language at all times. And so the teacher really needs to think about how are they setting up the learning space so that students know what strategies to use so that they continue to use the language and don't resort to English or some other language that they know, but focus instead on the target language they're learning. And finally, E for LE4 is the teacher consciously monitors teacher talk in order to maximize student opportunities to produce language. And this is really important because we want our students to be producing language in speaking, in writing, and in other ways, in signing, if you're an American Sign Language teacher. But we also have to make sure we as teachers don't talk too much and prevent those opportunities. So how do we maximize that and make sure we talk less and the students talk more? So these are our 5 sub-criteria for LE4. All right, so now we're going to take a closer look at those sub-criteria. And I asked you to answer this question. And we'll have a little bit longer to think about this question as we answer it as a poll question. So when you think about your teaching specifically and how your students learn, which of these sub-criteria are professional strengths for you? When there's 5, you can choose up to 3 that you believe are professional strengths for you personally. Consider your own teaching style, the different kinds of methods and strategies you use, and how your students are learning. Students of different ages, of course, learn in different ways. So you may have a very different classroom, and that brings up different professional strengths for you as a teacher. I'm going to go ahead and launch that poll question. We do have a few minutes to think about that. You can choose up to 3. We got another 30 seconds on our poll question. If you haven't put any responses yet, now is the time. Remember, this is just your assessment of your professional strengths in relation to these sub-criteria that may change over time or from different teaching assignments you have. But for this moment, choose up to 3 of these as your professional strengths. All right, let's take a look at what everyone had to say. Looks like a lot of these are professional strengths for a lot of people. I noticed that A has 61% of us who said this is a professional strength, that teachers facilitating activities that allow students to interact with others and negotiate meaning for a real-world purpose is important. We also have almost half saying C is a professional strength. The teacher facilitates activities that allow students to produce language within the range of the performance targets. And then we have about a third who say B is a professional strength, where the teacher facilitates activities that allow students to share a message with an audience, that presentational communication. We also have almost 20% who liked E. The teacher consciously monitors teacher talk in order to maximize student opportunities to produce language. And a little over 10% said that D is a professional strength. The teacher provides students with strategies that enable them to stay in the target language. Great. I'm going to keep that up on your poll and in your control panel so you can continue to look at the sub-criteria as we hear from our guest speakers. I asked them to consider what their professional strengths were as well and to talk on 1 to 3 of those. So Christen chose sub-criteria A, and I'll let her share with you about why this is a professional strength for her.
Hey everyone. So one thing we know about teaching and engaging our students is by making it relevant to them and making it all about them. And so I find that doing interpersonal tasks like talking to each other about things that are important to them is like the easiest thing, and especially when they get to see themselves. And gratefully, because of remote learning, all of my students now have computers. This was not the case before the pandemic. And so there's a positive right there. Now they all have computers and they're obviously used to filming themselves talk all the time. But this is a really easy way for me to engage my students, and they generally love to do this. And we'll be talking about a topic for a while, and I think that's the important thing to think about. Like, one strategy is like, how do we get our kids to do that? It's through repetition and scaffolding and making sure that they have those vocabulary words and they have those like repeated opportunities to practice these skills, I think, before you're doing whatever type of assessment. Obviously, if it's like a formative, then you're okay. But if it's a summative assessment, then you also want to make sure that they have the appropriate tools to be successful, right? So in this example that I have for you, I have 2 students and they are doing a dialogue. We were talking, it was, I think, from the beginning of the school year. And we were talking about like, what do you need to be successful in school? And we talked a lot about mental health, beyond kind of the superficial like school supplies, although that was an important thing. And so this was one of the summative activities, performance activities that they had to do to talk about how, like, what they had learned from the unit on how to be successful in school. And so, Anne Marie, if I could ask you to play the video for me. You don't have to do the whole thing, just a little bit. Thank you. So this is level 3 French class. I do have one heritage speaker, although she knows how to speak, but she doesn't know how to write. And then the other student is an AIG student, and she's amazing. So definitely like some of my more advanced students. But they did have, so I modeled this activity after the dialogue that we do on the AP French exam. And so they had prompts to kind of guide their dialogue. I did give them some time to like prepare and give some, like write down some vocabulary resources. And so they could check it throughout, but they are not reading a script. And I did encourage them. I was like, okay, you can do this a couple times. It doesn't need to be perfect. All of these things, because we're really working on your interpersonal communication. And so again, and it's also a scaffolding activity that will prepare them for later levels of French. As you know, with all of the AP language exams, we have to do an interpersonal conversation. And so I'm already starting to scaffold that skill early on. And they also can talk about things that are relevant to their lives while applying the things talked about in class. And I think what I've noticed as the year has gone by is that they love seeing themselves, right? So I can share these with the class and they enjoy laughing. And they like working with different people. And it's really, I think one thing that's hard is getting them to talk in front of the class sometimes. I don't know about you, but like on Monday morning, first period, it's like the most I just get like stares and I'm like, people wake up. But if I ask students to go film themselves doing a dialogue in front of like a computer, that's not a problem. They will do that. They respond better to that. So thinking about that, and yeah, that's all I have for you.
Well, thanks so much for sharing, especially a student video from your classes. I think you've answered all of the questions in the chat box about this. Shared with us, what level of students these are, how they're building proficiency, and the fact that this is interpersonal communication. They were not reading a script, so this is still a spontaneous, informal communication. All right, I'm going to go ahead and go to our next guest speaker. Bonnie chose these 3 sub-criteria A, B, and D to talk to you about today. So Bonnie, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. You can hear me and you can see me. At some point, if I'm lost, please let me know in the chat. Glad to see y'all here. I'm zooming from Durham, North Carolina. So I'm here to talk about my experiences in these 3 categories under the learning experiences TAO criteria over here. For me, I cannot divide A and B apart because for me, the real world purposes and the audience-based communication is the key of whatever we are teaching students. At some point, we'll see in our textbook, or I know many of you are not using a textbook, you are probably using some authentic materials, but the authentic materials all need a context. No matter you're using a magazine or you're picking any YouTube video clips, or if you are following one or more textbooks, think about those language use, think about when student can use them, to whom. Those are the contexts that we're talking about, and we always need to indicate to our students that who are you talking to? There's always an audience. Usually in class, the default audience is student to teacher, but in many cases, when students are graduating from our classrooms, they go into those real world, their audiences are not always teachers. Their audiences are not sympathetic listeners, and their audiences may come from different cultural backgrounds, political backgrounds, and other regional diverse backgrounds. So in that case, when we are showing students those target language, first of all, all those interpretive tasks should be coming from all different variety of those speakers. Either they are native speakers or non-native speakers. A lot of our students, when they are using a language in their classroom, or when they're using a language within America, time to time they are interacting with non-native speakers or non-heritage speakers. But when we're thinking about a bigger real world, there are a lot of chances the students need to interact with native speakers. So both contexts should be considered in our classroom management and in our class material, the instructional material preparation. So for example, the real world purpose, the real world situation is a communication based, it's not a grammar based. That means memorizing the conjugation is not so communication based. It's not gonna happen in the real world that a native speaker coming to one of our students and ask us, hey, how do you say the past tense of this word? Or where do you put in this sentence? Where do you feel, how do you fill in the blanks of this sentence? So those are not gonna happen in the real world. In the real world, people come to you, they assume that you have those knowledge, they assume you are already cultural competent because you speak the language, right? You must know some of those cultural taboos, some of those cultural rituals or customs. So then the next thing I'm gonna talk about is about the audience. We talk about both native and non-native speakers are the potential audiences of our students. And we can also think about those audiences that are either reading our students' writings, or they're listening or interpersonal speaking, communicating with our students by verbal language from the speaking. So both writing and speaking context should be considered for our students' audience choices. If we have guest speakers who are in their availability to come in and talk to our students, please do, because for some programs like my program, I'm the only Chinese teacher in the upper school. I have one section each level. Students are learning Chinese from me with the same classmate 4 years in a row. In the end, they will be very, very familiar with my voice, my intonation, and my pronunciation. But when I bring other guest speakers to them at the beginning, they cannot understand anything. That's the reality. That's their real world situation. If I send them to China, send them to any Chinese spoken regions, they won't be able to communicate with them. And that's so sad because they spent so many years. So in that case, in our daily practices, if we can invite a native speaker from an Asian American household or from a community or even from across Pacific Ocean on Zoom. Nowadays, we use the virtual platform so frequently. It's a lot easier for us to make that request. And I know there are a lot of agencies that are working on the global exchange language partnerships. Another thing that I also want to recommend is about the writing context. When our students say not only they're speaking in the future, they will also be able to text each other, to interact with each other's TikTok post or Instagram, Twitter post with the native speaker of the target language or culture. So why don't we do that in our daily life? We can have our own social platforms or start this pen pal partnership with another school if you don't have native speakers that you can reach. If we have those pen pals or those social media pals, e-pals relationships started when students learn this language, it's a lot easier for students to interact. And that is fun. That is very engaging for students to stay in the target language. In addition to that, we can also use a lot of games a lot of board games that I use in my class. Those are the games that I used to play when I first arrived in America. My American friends invited me to their houses, and then they started to play those board games. And for me, I'm doing those games in my second language. And that's how I improve. That's how I build up my language skills. So I'm using those board games, but then we do the Chinese mode. We try to do everything in the Chinese language. A lot of games like the headbands, for example, the rolling a dice activities, or even the recently, I think the one that we did is the rock, paper, scissors in the Chinese version. Also, never have I ever is a really good example for students to practice the past tense or the completion aspect in Chinese language. And I talked about this familiarization fatigue that many of our students are only used to use their language or be able to interpret the language from the speakers that they are familiar with for a long time. So as teachers, think about the real world situation, think about the real audiences that our students will be interacting with. It's just better, it's a lot better to involve in more native or non-native speakers in the class to make it very interactive and to make students have different new activities every now and then. They have to stay in the target language in that case, because those people, they are new, they don't know them. They have to really ask them a question. What is your hobby? What grade are you going into? Why you're studying Chinese? Why you come to school by car? What is going on in your school? Students don't want to talk about those topics to me because I'm in the same school. I know everything. I've been giving them the oral proficiency interviews every quarter, so I know so much about them. There's really nothing that I don't know about my students after 4 years. But if I invite other speakers to the campus, to their classrooms, they have to stay in the target language in order to express themselves to the other people. So I hope those little tips or those practices that I use in my class can give you just a little inspiration. I know many of you already have done that, teaching world languages right now in the virtual mode, in the even face-to-face with the mask on, or some schools are still doing the hybrid mode is really, really challenging. But always think about, we can always do something fun. We can always bring something new. And that is, I guess that's my only tip. Bring things new to your classroom. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ganger.
Well, thank you, Bonnie. That was great to hear your perspective, and especially to get your ideas for using games in the classroom in different ways. I appreciate both of our speakers today sharing those practical tips that motivate students and get them to use the language. That's so important. And like we were saying, one sort of, let's call it a benefit of the pandemic is that now everyone is much more used to technology. We can use that as teachers. Now that our students have computers and can do things like make quick videos of themselves rather than speaking out in class, which maybe makes them feel a little more comfortable, but is them using a tool that not everyone had before the pandemic. And likewise, we've got to think about how we do adapt to different learning spaces, whether we're teaching face-to-face or online or in some sort of hybrid environment. That too has been a learning experience for us all during the pandemic, and we're all still adjusting, but I think we're making good progress. And I appreciate both of our speakers today sharing these very practical examples from their classrooms about what we can do with students to get them to use the language. All right. Well, now that we've had a chance to think about our professional strengths and you've heard from two different teachers, let's now think about evidence of sub-criteria that with LE4 and the characteristics and behaviors that we would see would be that evidence on our K-12 world language classrooms. One of the things you have to ask yourself when we're reflecting as teachers and as professionals is, what do teachers and or students do in the classroom to show evidence of that LE4 sub-criteria? And I like the focus on do because really the answer is based on the verbs that are involved in these sub-criteria. So here they are on the screen again. Like we said before, a lot of the verbs are things that teachers do, facilitating activities that help students produce language, or providing students with strategies, or teachers monitoring their own teacher talk to make sure that they're giving opportunities for students to use the language in different ways. There's a lot of action happening with those verbs. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a Jamboard. Jamboard is a Google tool, by the way. I will stop here for a moment and ask you, by a show of electronic hands in the participant box, how many of you have used a Jamboard before? Maybe in one of these webinars, or maybe in your own classroom, or perhaps in other professional learning you've done. Just raise your electronic hand if you've used a Jamboard before. Right. Only seeing one or two hands, so this might be a new tool to everyone. Well, the good news is Jamboard is great. It's kind of like electronic Post-it notes, but you can do a lot more than that with it. We're going to use it as electronic Post-it notes today. And it is a Google tool. So if you already use Google tools, you've got Jamboard. So we're going to focus on that question. What characteristics and or behaviors would someone observe in your world language classroom if they were looking for evidence of one of the LE4 sub-criteria? Now, you should still also have the sub-criteria up in your control panel, but of course you got your handout too. We're going to think about which of the LE4 sub-criteria you want to write about. You only have to choose one. And then on a sticky note you create in the Jamboard, you're going to title your post with the letter of the sub-criteria you're talking about, A, B, C, D, or E. You're going to write your response in 2 sentences or less. You can include your name on the sticky note, or it can remain anonymous. That's up to you. You can take a few minutes to check out the other ideas on the Jamboard. And then this activity will take us about 6 minutes, which will put us in a good place with time as far as wrapping up today at 5. So let's take a look at the Jamboard. Since many of you are new to it, I do actually have sort of a how-to slide that I got from one of our previous guest speakers, Linda Ramirez-Carter in Wake County Public Schools. And like I said, Jamboard is a Google tool. When you go into Jamboard, you get a little control panel like this. You're simply going to click on the little Post-it note, the sticky, on the control panel, and that will open up a blank sticky note for you. You can choose the color of your sticky, yellow, green, blue, pink, or orange, just by clicking on those. Then you write in your response on the sticky note, and then of course you click save. So I'm going to go over to our Jamboard real quick to kind of show you how this works now that you've seen the how-to slide. Here's our Jamboard for this activity. I've got all of our characteristics there. Remember, you're just picking one. Talk about the evidence you see in the classroom. If we went into your classroom looking for this. And so what I speakers today was we go ahead and do the sticky note on this Jamboard, and both of them were able to get that done, even with their busy schedules. So notice that they have chosen different colors for their stickies, but they have commented on the different sub-criteria and what you would actually see in their classrooms as evidence for that. So over here on the side is where you have your control panel. And like I said, you just click on the little sticky note. It opens up. You can choose a different color if you want, and then write the response. Well, let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to put this slide up so that you know what you're responding to. You've got your question there: what characteristics and or behaviors would someone observe in your world language classroom if they were looking for evidence of one of the LE4 sub-criteria? I'll put links into the chat box. You can go directly to the Jamboard. I've actually got the bit.ly link you see there at the top, as well as the direct link in case that works better. Sometimes, depending on where you're joining us from, it's better to have the direct link. So I include both in the chat box so that you have those, and then you can go directly to our Jamboard. All right, they're in there. I'll go ahead and start our clock. Remember, we're taking 6 minutes, so go ahead and create a sticky note. And then once you've got it posted so everyone can see, do take a look around at what others have said. I know you're all working away, so I'm going to pop over to our Jamboard to see how things are coming along. Oh, that looks great. Several people have posted stickies already. We've got so many great ideas for people's classroom, but it's also a great resource for us to think about as teachers. Lots of ideas here of things that other teachers do. The best learning we can do professionally is to watch other teachers do it. And since we can't go right in the classroom, doing something like this allows us to share what teaching strategies work in our classrooms for our students and for us. All right, I'll let you enjoy what's there on the Jamboard. Keep in mind, this is still open to us even after this broadcast today. I see a couple folks who said they're joining us via cell phone, so it's kind of hard to do an activity like this, but don't worry. We'll still have the Jamboard up for a while, and you can come back to it either to add a sticky to it, even if you want to add more than one, you can do that, or just to read through what other people have posted. It's a very interesting thing to look at and to consider all the different ideas here that are good ways to focus on that LE4 sub-criteria that helps us look at interpersonal communication and presentational communication, 2 of our 4 standards. All right, well, thank you for sharing today all of the things that you do in your classrooms. Let's go ahead and do our wrap up and some reminders so that we can close out. Everyone today, by virtue of attending, gets to be added to the World Language Instructors listserv. That may have been where you got the information about today's broadcast as well, but I want to make sure you're always connected through our listservs. If you want to sign up for other NCCPI listservs, in addition to World Language Instructors, which is a K-21, there's one called World Language Education News. There's one for Dual Language Immersion or DLI educators, and there's one specifically for NC Linguafolio. There are also other NC DPI listservs that you may be interested in other subject areas. For example, my ESL colleagues have several listservs that they run. And there are things like global education and charter schools and so forth that you can also sign up for and get updates and announcements from. So I put that in the chat box, and you're welcome to go there and type in your email address and sign up for the information you want. Also, just a reminder that our 2021-2022 World Language Webinar Series is a paired series. So there's always a part 1 and a part 2 for each of the domains we're looking at. Today's broadcast will be followed by the part 2 on Wednesday, February the 2nd. Our World Language webinars are always on World Language Wednesdays from 4 to 5. And so I'll put in the chat box also the registration for that broadcast if you'd like to sign up and be with us that day. It is, of course, Groundhog's Day, and I think holidays in several other countries that we teach about as well. So it's kind of a fun way to remember it. Also, don't forget that the materials and recordings from each webinar, including this one, will be posted as archives. So you can use those resources locally, or you can adapt them for local professional development. In addition, one thing we've been doing this school year is using the archives and making them available for a period of time so that you can complete the activities asynchronously and earn a certificate of completion. Obviously, you're attending the live broadcast, so you'll get your certificate of attendance. But if you have colleagues who would like to go and watch the recording and do our activities as well in a Qualtrics exit ticket survey, they can still get credit for our broadcast for a period of time. Also, don't forget that our World Language Webinar Series Canvas Hub is now available. That's another new thing this year. We're putting everything together in one spot for you so you can get all the information about webinars, our current series, as well as our past series, some of our archives from the different school years past. So I'm going to put that link again in the chat box for you so you have an easy access, but it is on the screen too. I do like bit.ly links. They're an easy way to get information when we need it. And so our World Language Webinar Series Canvas Hub is at bit.ly/WLNNC webinars. This slide is just a reminder that the CEU certificates are coming. Please note that your public school unit, your district or charter school does have to approve all professional development in all formats. But like I said, individuals who participate in our live broadcast earn a certificate with 1 contact hour. And that comes in the form of an email with an attached certificate of attendance approximately 1 week from today. Sometimes we get them out a little bit faster, sometimes it takes us just a little bit, but expect it via email. And that's it. We're ending right on time. I want to thank you for joining us today. I know it's been a busy week already, and it's only Wednesday because we're all back to school. But here's our NCDPI World Languages team. You can always call on us with any questions. I'm Anne-Marie Gunter, your World Languages consultant. You can reach me by email or phone. We do have a new NCDPI landing page on the NCDPI website for World Languages, so be sure to check that out if you haven't already. I'll put my contact information in there. We're also on Twitter. I tend to send out our things on Twitter that we've had on our listservs and mark them on Twitter with a hashtag World Language Wednesday. So that's where you can find us at. Also, my supervisor, Stacy Daniel, our section chief over World Languages, ESL, and English Language Arts, is available to you. You can contact her with any questions. And Teresa Parker is especially important to you because that is the person who will be emailing your certificate of attendance for today. So you might want to take a look at her email address and know to expect an email from her. Again, thank you very much to our guest speakers today. We appreciated learning from you as model world language teachers and thinking about all the things we can do in our classrooms that you might have suggested to us or reminded us that would be good tools. We appreciate you having everyone here today. And I thank everyone for joining us and sharing about their classroom on our Jamboard and spreading those ideas across the state as we learn together. Hope everyone has a great evening.